Gerry Griffin is the former director of NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston. During NASA's Apollo program, Gerry was a flight director in mission control for all of the Apollo manned missions. He was also lead flight director for 3 lunar landing missions, Apollo 12, 15, and 17, and led a team of flight controllers responsible for the safe return of the Apollo 13 astronauts. Gerry was a technical advisor for the movies Apollo 13, Contact, in which he also acted, and Deep Impact. Andy Aldrin is the son of famed Apollo 11 moonwalker Buzz Aldrin, and a leader in the aerospace industry focusing on the intersection of policy, business, and academia. He founded the International Space University Center for Space Entrepreneurship at Florida Tech, where he was also director of the Aldrin Space Institute. Andy's experience also includes leadership positions at Moon Express, an emerging new space company, Boeing, the RAND Corporation, and the Institute for Defense Analysis. Rod Pyle is an author, journalist, filmmaker, and editor-in-chief for Ad Astra magazine. He has written 15 books on space history, exploration, and development. Rod has also produced, directed, and written programming for History Channel's Modern Marvels, the History Channel documentary Beyond the War of the Worlds, and numerous titles for Discovery Communications. He worked in visual effects on Star Trek, Deep Space Nine, as well as various TV pilots. Rod is regularly featured on national media as a space expert.
So the moral of that story is if you're smart and you want to become known in the space business, manage to get yourself up on stage with 2 really important people everybody else knows about and treated the same way. So this is like the third time I've been able to do that here, and about the 5th time I've done it the last 4 years. And by the way, Tony, it's 20 books, just in case anybody's counting. I guess he left, okay. So thank you for coming. We had a session here earlier today that was absolutely splendid, and we're going to repeat some of that tonight, but because you're a specially focused audience, because you're part of the NSS, let's hear it. Oh, okay. We're going to tailor a little more to your interests, I think, and we hope you'll have some incisive questions, because we encourage debate. So I edit Ad Astra magazine, which I've been doing for about 4 years now. Hopefully you've noticed a difference. Right, Aggie? Aggie's my counterpart at Ad Astra. We have a great time doing it. And we try every issue to get at least some articles in about the big settlement discussion. And this does come up sometimes. People say, why don't you have more big settlement articles? And the answer is I try to get them in at least once a year, but there isn't that much movement in that area. So what I really try to focus on is the increments moving towards that. So whether it's life support or radiation abatement or habitats on Mars, we have an issue coming out in a couple of weeks that's got an article on biomedical issues in there. We've got another one coming out, which is gonna be interesting, about what happens. What do you do if somebody dies on the way to Mars? How do you handle that? And what are some of the issues, both logistical and more metaphysical? So that's kind of the direction we're heading. But tonight, we're here to talk about space settlement, I think, because that's how we roll. So we've got 2 great experts here, and I guess I'll start off. Do you guys want to make introductory statements, or shall I just jump into questions?
Either way.
You're the boss here.
You're the boss.
Oh boy, you guys are in serious trouble. So I remember enough about the space race to recall the big plans that we had. So everything from what was going on in the Apollo Applications Office. Everybody here know what that was, I assume? So during the Apollo program, we had a specific part of NASA, small, that was planning on follow-on projects to do with that technology and beyond. And there was, as I recall, a fair number of studies about longer presence on the moon, bigger footprint on the moon, both static habitats and roving lunar module habitats and so forth, and ultimately beyond that to Mars. We had all those Mars architecture reference studies. From your perspective today, Do you think that would have worked with that hardware had we continued along that path?
Well, so much has changed now, Rod. I think at the time that planning, and that's what it was very appropriate because all we had was what we had. And we could imagine the future, but we weren't there. Well, part of that future has changed now. For one thing, we're in the transition from a government-only program to a commercial and government partnership that we've seen work in low Earth orbit. And with SpaceX hauling people and cargo up and down in low Earth orbit and other players to follow. So now we've got a different kind of team, for one thing. And we've got people more serious about looking at the business side of space, particularly at least out to the moon, as far as that. And I think it'll go farther eventually. So the ground rules have changed a little bit and the capabilities have changed, but the idea, I think, is still good. And that planning a long time ago was appropriate. I think as we look at the next 5 to 10 years, I think we're going to see an increase in the commercial participation, particularly at low Earth orbit. And then obviously we've got contractors, some of them are also in that business now of commercial space that are going to be taking government contracts and working on that next settlement on the moon. And the secret, or not secret, but maybe the word that I like to use is sustainability. We've got to be able to go to the moon and stay there for a while in order to really understand and determine what the business prospects and science prospects are and all of that. So I think we're at a good point right now. We've been in this transition now for maybe 2 or 3 years, and it's not over yet. It's gonna take a little while longer to get some more players on the commercial side.
Boy, did he set you up for a follow-up or what? So we were talking about this last night.
Yep.
Where do you see it happening? Talk about human settlement out there, because we write about, we talk about, we discuss amongst ourselves everything from low Earth orbit to free space colonies out at L5 or somewhere similar, or the moon or Mars. What do you see? Because you're the guru here.
It's foggy.
Professor.
It's foggy. I need a crystal ball. So, you know, we're really, really bad at predicting when something is going to happen.
Yeah.
And I can't do that. What I think you can reasonably do is you can talk about the roadmap and to get there. And by the way, you don't need a roadmap to go in a straight line, which is what most technology roadmaps are, right? We do this, and then we get there. You don't need a roadmap for that. You just need a speedometer and a gas gauge. But we do need real roadmaps because I think we need to know where the inflection points are in the future and what to do when we get there. And it's not like Yogi Berra said, when you get to a fork, take it, right? But I think I want to key on one of the things that Gerry said, which was sustainability. And NASA and probably government agencies, by definition, I won't say by definition, by sort of constraints and boundaries, cannot sustain a human spaceflight program forever, because at some point you want to move on to the next thing. And the way that you sustain a program forever is by creating something which is economically sustainable. Because if it's economically sustainable, as long as people are making a profit, they're gonna stay there, right? Unless the government screws it up. I mean, I don't want to get all libertarian, but I do. That is an economically sustainable presence. What needs to happen in the case of the moon, which is probably since we want to talk about settlements, that's probably the best and nearest opportunity. And there has to be a government, industry, private, public sector partnership to make that work. The trouble with that is historically we're not very good at it. We managed, I mean, we look at COTS and commercial resupply and we go, yeah, this is great. It was an accident. We really didn't, there wasn't a whole lot of analysis that went into it. But to do this and make it work on the moon, it's going to be hard. And I think one of the challenges, we know what the pathway is to lunar resources. We do. I mean, smart people have been looking at this for a long time. We don't have a clue what the economic and political pathway is. And I think that's going to be one of the really big challenges.
So I want to ask one more question, and then I'm going to throw it open to the smart people out here. And this is kind of continuation of what we were talking about earlier, because I wanted to talk about it more, but I didn't get a chance. So I taught a class, I think last year or the year before, co-taught with a guy named David Shrunk, a class about lunar settlement and some of the various pathways that might take. And one of the needles I kept sticking into the class was, not everything, most of what I read about settlement is built on, or settlements is built on the assumption of Western culture. It's going to work under British common law, or at least as a basis, and it's going to be modeled on the kinds of things we've done so far in the West. And yet when I look at something like the Antarctic model, and a lot of people argue about whether that can work on the moon or not, but it's kind of all we've got, right? That or military. When you look at something like the Antarctic model, you do have the Scotty Edmondson base, the South Pole, which is American, and then you've got McMurdo. But then you've got all kinds of other national bases clustered around the continent. People come together to work at McMurdo cooperatively, but after a set amount of time, they go back to their national territories to speak their language and eat their food and follow their conventions and so forth. And from the people I've known that have spent a lot of time down there, that seems to keep things at about the right amount of pressure that you want, right amount of tension. On the moon, you don't probably, at least not for the foreseeable future, have those options. So given all the complications, I don't just mean scientific and engineering, but I'm talking about cultural blending, especially between East and West, because as we were talking about earlier, our primary, if you don't want to say competitor, our primary match right now in doing this is China. How do you see that playing out, say, on the South Lunar Pole, where we're probably both going to be there within a moderate amount of time?
Yeah, it's not going to play out like Antarctica. Because the thing is, Antarctica really, people want to go there for scientific reasons, but nobody really harbors any real desire to extract resources or do other economic activity. Whereas when you talk about the moon and you talk about those special places that are sitting on the edges of craters, where on one side you got the permanently shaded region and lots of water ice. We don't know what it looks like necessarily, but potentially there's something of tremendous value there. And on the other side you have permanent light. And so these are really precious places. And it's inevitable that there will be competition, however you want to call it. And it's not going to be a war or anything like that, but countries will want to have people working on those spots, because whatever the Outer Space Treaty says, if you have a group of people working, and maybe it's going to look like an oil rig, working there, and no one else is going to come nearby, because you can't land nearby, anywhere nearby, right? We understand now that the ejecta from a rocket landing on the moon goes for kilometers. And so you are, by necessity, irrespective of any kind of legal agreements, going to have keep-out zones. And so what you're going to have is, I think, I won't say a necessity, but a drive, a real incentive for countries, and there are really only two countries that are going to be able to afford to do this, the US and China, to get there, to start attempting to extract resources, but more than anything, establishing a claim, however you categorize that claim, on an area. And it's, a friend of mine has a T-shirt, and he's a lawyer. He has a T-shirt that says, "Where explorers go, lawyers follow," which is great. But it needs to have a subscript that says, "at a respectable distance." Because when we go to the moon, we'll figure out what makes sense, and the law should follow what makes sense, and the agreements should follow all of that stuff. And I think, stepping forward to, what you talked about in terms of international cooperation, China and the U.S. will be economic governmental competitors. It is actually conceivable. Right now it doesn't seem that way, but it's conceivable that you could find joint ventures and things like that between U.S. and Chinese companies that could cooperate. It is in many ways a lot more conceivable than seeing the U.S. and Chinese governments cooperating. But the more important thing is, if they are up there doing things that are productive and making money, they will have incredible incentives to continue doing that, and the governments will have disincentives to stop it. So that's where I hope it goes. But as I said before, there are real challenges to go there, and they're not necessarily technical.
Well, it's interesting because I think, and I want to set you up for your answer. No, I mean in a good way. We were bitter enemies with the Soviet Union for years. Now we're back into a tough situation with Russia. Personally, I think what's kept us at peace with China for as long as we have been is the fact that we're their best customer. And there's this is globalization taken to an extreme between these two countries. I wonder if that same thing will happen on the moon. Now, you were with NASA when internationalism started, with Apollo-Soyuz and then with Mir. So what's your perspective? Because you've seen this happen once without any business interest to speak of.
I think Andy pretty well nailed it down, with one exception that I would put in the front. I think you said it would be U.S. and China. I think it'll be the West in China.
I agree with that.
Because ESA, Canada, probably Australia, maybe others will come in. And when you get to the culture piece of it, how do you live and work in all these countries and got different styles and so forth? I think that first settlement is going to be a requirement. We can't handle the Chinese. They'll do whatever they want to. But on the West piece of that, I think we're going to see some standards set up before we go. It says, here's what we're going to do. We've got to probably, you got to share food supplies and all that other cargo that'll have to go with them, and then resupply them. So I think we're going to have to set a standard. That has not been a problem in the space station. The space station has worked well with the ESA partners and those other players, Italy, individual countries that, besides going through ESA. That's not been a problem at all. There has been a somewhat standoffish relationship between the Russians, part of the space station, and the West. And not unfriendly, but just kind of go do their own thing and eat their own food at their own time and play their music, etc. So I think as far as the West is concerned, we'll have to set some standards pretty early and say, okay, we are going to go by the laws of U.S. or Canada or somebody, France. You pick it. And that's what we're going to govern by. And if somebody steps out of line, that's what they're going to be measured against. So I think that's going to be easy enough to do, except for the China part, which they're going to go wherever they want to, when they want to, and do what they want to. And if we ever had another space race, quote unquote, that's probably the next one. Chinese are good at what they're doing. They're learning, I think, extremely fast. They've had some failures, and that builds up scar tissue that helps a bit. At least you know what you're up against. And I think they will be really good competitors for the West.
And it won't just be China. I mean, I think we're really going to see, I shouldn't say this if I have any sense of certainty, but there's a future out there where you end up with kind of a bifurcation of the space market, both politically and economically, where you're going to have a China Belt and Road oriented market and a Western market. But if you think about things like satellite constellations, of course, Chinese are building massive constellations as well as we are. And I think it's going to be really challenging for the United States, but probably most Western companies, to get comfortable with the idea of transmitting a lot of their communications over a Chinese network. And I think you're going to see the same thing on the U.S. And it's going to be really interesting in that sense, because it's going to be kind of the Belt and Road market versus the Western market. If I was a betting person, which I'm not, but I would consider it if somebody would take this bet, I would bet on the Western market, because I think it's just going to be, it is much larger, much better developed, and will attract many more customers to it. But I think that this isn't to say, this isn't China baiting or anything. It is just, it's a reality of international relations that at some point you end up, the system likes, the international, the global geopolitical system likes bipolar systems. And it finds those pretty stable. And so I'm not particularly challenged by it. It drives my students nuts when I tell them this, but there are a lot of things about the Cold War that were horrible and wasteful and stupid. But it was a stable geopolitical system where we understood each other. And, I mean, the critical thing we forget is humanity created the ability to destroy itself. And we didn't. And the reason we didn't was US and Soviet generals understood, and they had a very similar understanding of what was at stake here. And so a bipolar thing with China and the US isn't necessarily a bad thing, and we'll end up cooperating to a much greater degree economically than we did with the Soviet Union. But and it's not just going to be space where we're going to see this, obviously. We just don't want to see it in other countries, to be honest with you.
And one of the things to add to that, I really think you just said something that triggered a thought. I think we will get closer to China. We have a chance of getting closer to China in space than we do on Earth.
Absolutely.
And the reason is, I think we'll find, particularly at lunar distance, which is different than Earth orbit, I think we'll find kind of like seamen, that people at sea that help each other, different countries, different cultures. If they get in trouble, they pitch in and try to pick up survivors or whatever. And I think we're going to see a little bit of that on the ocean of space, where people that sail out in those waters are going to help each other when they have to.
Well, when you've been eating hardtack for 6 months, Chinese dinner is really welcome. So I think that's part of it. There is a cultural perspective too, though, as we look, past the immediate, say, next 8 to 10 years, where you're kind of living in this oil derrick sort of environment, or oil rig sort of environment. When you start doing what we're doing now on Earth, which is worrying more about diversity and inclusion and so forth, and you're on a base, let's say, and you're in this very hostile environment where everything has to take place within these 4 metal walls inside my lunar cave or whatever, but you've got people with different dietary requirements and wishes. You've got people that want to pray, perhaps, for a couple of times per day, and time on space station is really expensive. It's, I don't know, $100,000 an hour or something. I don't even know if I've got that number right. It may be more.
You probably need a 0 on there.
Yeah, I think it's low. And burial practices and all that kind of thing. These are significant expenses, and if we're talking about trying to balance that government versus commercial, and government is usually the first to push for these kind of changes, at least in the West, I wonder how that's going to be rolled into the equation. And I'm not necessarily looking for an answer. It's just something I'm bringing up as a point of conversation.
So just to carry that on, I think where it gets really interesting will be Mars, because I think, one, there will be tremendously greater incentive to cooperate on Mars. And Mars will look much more like McMurdo and Antarctica.
You mean like staying alive, right?
What?
Yeah. Big part of it is staying alive.
It is. Yeah. But the interesting thing is, you're there for a minimum of, let's almost 2 years, pretty much, 500 days-ish. But really, you're going to end up there, just because of the logistics of getting people there, getting them back, you're going to end up there for multiple synodic periods. So you're going to be there for a long time. And the people on Mars are going to be Martians, first and foremost. They're not going to be Chinese. But you're going to have this bizarre situation where they're going to be dependent on their home government for certain things. And so there's going to be a weird sort of interplanetary relationship there that's going to be fascinating, to at least to speculate on until we get there and actually do it. But Mars will be very different from the moon, I think.
I don't know what Martian cuisine will be like.
Lots of soybeans, I can tell you that right now.
It's soybeans with perchlorate dressing.
Okay, so that was a nice short introduction for everything. So let's ask some questions here. I'm going to toss you a softball first, right out of the box. So I'm going to point this at Gerry most because he was around then. Gerry, do we really go to the moon? I'm just kidding. So
I saw it my dad shaving, actually.
Yeah. So my question is, for all the things you're talking about that you're addressing right now, there are a lot of people on this earth that will look at you and say, why? Why spend the money on this? Why do this? Why is this necessary? What is the point? We have too many problems here to address, too many issues.
You're asking this at an NSS event?
I am asking this. How do you address this? How do you address this to young people? I mean, how do you explain the purpose for this and the reality of why this is important?
Well, I think there's a lot of answers to that, and all of them are good. I start with one that's more from the 20,000 foot level, that I really do believe that someday in the future, maybe 10,000 years from now, we're going to have to get off this planet, not because of global warming, because we're just going to use up the resources in it eventually. Now, if we want the human species to survive, then we're going to have to go somewhere else and at least open up a colony first and then take more people later, a little bit like what happened in this country. To do that, we've got to learn how to travel in space. We've got to learn how to land on places, explore them, reject them, accept them, see if there's something we might do to make it habitable for humans. And what we did in Apollo was a little teeny step in that direction. And what we're about to do with Artemis, the follow-on, is not much more. It's a little more, but it's still tiny, tiny steps. So we've got to start this process, I think, and I think I'm preaching to the choir here, and not give up on it. We need to put a percentage of our treasure into planning for that long-range future. Now, in the immediate future, we may have the economic aspects that would make going to the moon, maybe eventually onto Mars, as being okay from a business. Some business plan will close. Maybe not. But I still think it's worthwhile to do that. And the third reason I think we need to do it, and fly into space with humans and do things, is to inspire our young people. And it's already had a great effect. It turns young people on. I think you ought to tell them about what you're doing with the satellites and all that with kids. It is amazing how young people respond to this task of going into space. And I think it's the excitement of getting there is what holds their attention. But then they finally figure out you got to figure out how to get there. And so I think we're growing up generations now of kids with STEM in their minds. That science, technology, engineering, and math makes sense. And so that's another reason I think to keep the effort going and be ready for the future. I tell the kids when I can talk to them, you got to be ready. And if you aren't, you're not going to play in the game.
So, Gerry, that's not 20,000 feet, that's 20,000 parsecs.
All right.
Let's take another question, because
we could go
on this particular one for
about chat here, and the one from the chat is basically with the current progress we're seeing on the commercial sector and with what we're doing with Artemis, et cetera. How is that speeding up or expediting all of this going forward? Some would say that because we haven't been back to the moon in 50 years that we're going very slowly. Others would say we're actually speeding it up. What do you guys think of that?
So most of this had to come from one of my students. Most of them think we are moving really fast and that this is amazing and this is the dawn of the commercial age. They don't realize this is like the third time we've done this, right? We did it with the shuttle because the shuttle was going to revolutionize space travel. We were going to fly 50 times a year at $8 million a flight, right? $8 million. I'm serious.
That's right.
With an M.
I was on the Hill trying to sell that idea.
I wouldn't admit that.
I was with George Lowe.
And then we did it again in the late 90s, and we were going to darken the sky with teledesic and all of this other stuff. And now we're doing it again. And so what's different? One of the things that's different is in both the first and the second waves, as I'll call it, it was a single event that wiped us out. You had Challenger, and then when Iridium failed, it took everything down. And Iridium failed for probably a lot of stupid business reasons. And one of the things that's different today, I think, is the kind of institutional basis is a lot stronger. We have much more of a human resources basis. There are literally millions of kids coming out of college that can build a rocket for you. And we didn't have that before. There is a much more robust financial system than we had during the time of Iridium. So I mean, all of that stuff leads me to believe that we're building the foundation to really accelerate. But there are a lot of things that have me really concerned, and I don't want to necessarily go into that now because we will use up all of the time. But I think, we have an opportunity to really accelerate the development. And one of the things that I come back to is we're making a transition from a program that was, actually somewhat artificial in the sense that the Cold War created the motivation to go out into space and do things because we wanted to beat the Soviets out there. And we did that. The real challenge is, can we fill in that salient that we created artificially with real activity, sustainable economic activity? And I think we're close to being able to do that. But I also think it's entirely possible that we as a community could screw it up again.
Can I just add something to the end of that? Where'd Tony go?
He's down here.
Oh, there you are. It's not popular to stand in defense of SLS. And we just had a couple of articles in Ad Astra that sort of took it to task, not pushing back on SLS as much as comparing it to Starship and to a lesser extent New Glenn. But, NASA's, I think, been fairly smart in saying, okay, we're going to engage these companies. We're basically going to seed them with money so that they have to stick around and keep doing what they're doing and succeed, hopefully. But really, at this point, we have two individuals running two companies with two systems that can realistically compete with SLS. We got a lot of other people that want to, but they're going to need to either be fully funded or get a lot of really agreeable shareholders to come along with the program, which is tough to do. There's a chance that Jeff Bezos could wake up tomorrow and say, this rocket thing is for the birds. I don't want to do this anymore. And, I'm sorry I took that property, NASA, to build those buildings, but this isn't working out for me. I'm tired of putting in $1 billion a year. I don't want to build the New Glenn. And that's one down. Starship, heaven forbid, and I'm not suggesting that this would necessarily play out this way, but if suddenly Elon Musk had a medical emergency and wasn't able to run that company anymore, it's in kind of a tenuous situation in terms of successors, I think, in some ways. And if you didn't have Starship, and if they couldn't fulfill that lunar contract, suddenly you've got the SLS as the one rocket standing. It's an imperfect set of analogies, but I hope the point makes sense. I think it's an important backbone plan to have. It is very traditional, it is expendable, but those two things actually give it some strengths that the other systems may not necessarily turn out to have over some period of time. You're giving me a really funny look.
I am.
Like, how dare you?
No. I mean, it's interesting, but what SLS has is a market, right? They've got a government that will pay for it. Mm-hmm. It's less clear in the case of New Glenn. It's a big rocket. There is a reason that Boeing, Lockheed, ULA, Northrop Grumman didn't build really, really big rockets. I mean, they built the Heavy, and for the Heavy, there was one mission every other year.
Right.
Okay. So the question with Starship is, we have, you guys, you all know this stuff, but pre-constellations, let's just say, we flew about 400 tons into orbit every year. And that didn't change. One of the interesting things is when Elon came into the market at half the price of ULA, there was zero market elasticity. Nothing happened. There's still the same 20 GEO launches. It didn't change anything. So if once you launch these constellations, and Elon is saying, I got to launch this thing 100 times a year, who's going to pay for it? I mean, launch 100 times a year, launching what?
Right. What are you putting in the cargo bay?
And so it's okay. Maybe there's something that magically appears, but let's be honest. It's magic. And magic happens all the time. And I may be the cosmic curmudgeon, but if it's still, somebody's got to tell me what it is that's going to happen. You fly to Mars, that's maybe 10 starships, right? And so it has to start economically. It has to start with a market, and I actually kind of get it with New Glenn, because I think the plan there is that you use half of the performance. And it lets you do the same thing that we do with jets. We're not running jet engines as at the highest performance we possibly could. And so that kind of makes sense, but I don't know where you get 1.5 million tons of stuff that needs to go into space right now. That's why I was looking weird.
You do have to add the military in there that Musk is providing rides for now. I know it's not
what?
the numbers.
ULA was
not the numbers you're looking for. Yeah, I know.
But there is one other, and this is just a small part of it, but when I look at the projects, and I gave a presentation to this group recently about the 10 hottest things JPL was working on, and particularly in planetary science exploration, there's so much time and money spent on miniaturization and mass reduction. And we want to trade this many grams of fuel for this much of a science package. And if we do aerobraking, then we can have another couple of kilograms of spectroscopes and so forth. The one good thing that happens in your scenario with Starship is, as we were talking about earlier, I can go ahead and build a Mars orbiter out of lead if I want to, and make it 30 feet across and set it up there. It's not a good idea, but it might be cheaper.
Well, but okay, so you double the 400 to 800.
Well, I said it was
You got a long way. You got a long way to get to 1.5 million.
Yeah. But I can launch bricks to the moon and build my hut out of bricks if I want to. I don't even have to use ISRU. I can just say, okay, you're giving me that look again. Yes.
It is the NSS, I guess.
I have two things I'd like to raise. Maybe the first for Andy and the second for Gerry. The first, you mentioned diversity briefly, and I'm wondering how our growing understanding of who can fly in space affects that issue. So, when your dad flew, it was the right stuff mentality. Only the top fraction of 1% of people were healthy enough and, had the stuff to fly in space. And now we have a 90-year-old Hollywood actor flying in space. How does that expanded view of things affect?
Yeah, in ways we don't know, but I think about the moon, and I think about Kim Kardashian going to the moon. Think about it, because it's
why?
Because it's just something that jars your brain so much that you think, oh my God, I got to build a habitation system, a transportation system for Kim Kardashian. And so, but that is kind of what your customers are looking to look like.
No, you're right.
And so
filter the makeup out of the.
You've got to rethink everything you're doing from the very beginning. And first of all, one of the first things you do is it has to be entertainment, and you are going to have to trade safety for entertainment value if you're going to run this business. And it's like of all of the problems with flying human in space, for most space missions, it's like you think of space sickness and go, okay, great, 36 hours, they're done with it. If somebody's chronic, you send them home and you go on to Mars. But if you're going to the moon, the last thing you want is Kim Kardashian projectile vomiting on Instagram. Right? I mean, and so you've got to think about all of that stuff. It's just going to force us to rethink how we do human spaceflight for that audience. And it's going to be cool because, I think it's never going to be a big market for lunar tourism, but it is going to be, if you think about it, some of the experiences being on the moon, you could be on the edge of a crater, just like dig a hole through the edge of a crater, and on one side of it, you're looking at the Earth. You've got a domed restaurant. You're looking at the Earth, which is pretty cool. That's got to be one of the best views in the entire universe for an Earthling, right? A Martian doesn't care about looking at the Earth, but and then at the other side, if you're hanging over the crater, you're in complete darkness, and you've got an astonishing view of the night skies, and so. It's just, there's some incredible experiences there, so things will happen, but we have to completely rethink what we do, and a lot of it is going to have to do with training. Selection is going to be a hairy thing, because if Kim Kardashian comes with $100 million, it's going to be tough to say no, plus you'll pay for it on TMZ, right, big time.
So I'm looking forward to going to the moon, to deal with my osteoporosis when the time comes, because it'll be a non-issue, and B, because I'll weigh a lot less all of a sudden, and I kind of like that idea. I'll be able to get around like a Sprite. Now, you be careful.
So, think about this.
Yes.
Think about diving off of a 100-foot diving board. You'll just kind of float down. How cool would that be?
Into low G water.
Yeah. No, it would just, but there are all kinds of things that make this a really cool experience, but it is going to involve really rethinking everything that we do about you'll have to call it the customer experience, and life support systems and all of that kind of stuff. It's, I hope I'm around to see it. Not necessarily Kim Kardashian on the moon, but.
Second issue, Gerry, is a big departure, and I'm glad you mentioned 10,000 years in the future, because for the first 5 decades of my life, we didn't know if there were other planets in the universe beyond our solar system. And the first time we had a telescope capable of determining that, the first place we pointed it, we found planets. And now the last I saw, I think we're up to 5,000 exoplanets, not to mention others, but 5,000 exoplanets that have been discovered. It seems to me we don't, as a society, as a human race, we haven't really appreciated the magnitude of what that means long-term to have the universe populated in that way. You have thoughts about that?
Yeah, in fact, it takes me back to the movie Contact, where Jodie Foster is talking about the count in the universe, and the way she builds up to that. It's in Carl Sagan's book, Contact, and but the way she is very logical, and it's billions upon billions of possibilities. There's got to be another place out there that is enough Earth-like for humans to survive on it. There's got to be. The numbers just tell you it's too big, too many. So I really think you're right. The discoveries that we found in our own solar system, plus, they are looking for Earth-like places around other suns, and they found some that look promising. And I think maybe the James Webb Telescope will help with some of that, because it'll be much higher resolution and distance than Hubble. So I think I think you're exactly right. I think the public is not. This is not a subject that is going to turn on wild enthusiasm. by everybody that reads it. But people that think about it, I think, realize that this planet we're living on is fragile enough, and it's also pretty durable. We've proved that too. But I just don't think it's going to last forever. We're going to use up the resources, and we may have global warming too that cuts down on our land mass and agriculture, all of that. I think that's a long way off, but I really do think the numbers count here, and it gives us a way potentially to do what we're talking about. That is to go somewhere else if we have to.
Okay, I got a question from Martin on Facebook. He says, or he asks, it would seem that there needs again to be a polarizing event that ties universities, ULA, SpaceX, Earth's many governments, countries, et cetera, together to come up with a roadmap and specific goals for space settlement. Hoping the event isn't a loss of Earth threat, what are your thoughts on what it might be?
ULA and SpaceX working together?
I think I've got it. So there's a meeting in the UN. We haven't heard anything about the Chinese space program for a while because they tend to be pretty quiet until they achieve something. And they walk up to the American representatives and hand them the Apollo 11 flag and say, thanks for leaving that behind so we could bring back a souvenir. That'll get our attention. It would certainly get Congress engaged.
I don't think the flag is still there, Rod. Do you?
It's still there. It's just white.
Okay.
It's bleached out. Okay.
One
above those overboots, whatever they tossed out of the LEM, let's say, something for the moon.
But what will it take to pull everybody together on one common cause?
Alien invasion.
Don't look up. There might be an asteroid up there.
I think Andy hit it a while ago. I think the first time, if we find either some form of life on Mars, we're not going to find it on Moon, I don't think, but on Mars we might find evidence of prior life. That's going to change the game. When somebody reaches in and pulls out a bone of a dinosaur or something, it's going to change the game. The other thing that's going to change the game, and this could be at the lunar distance at the Moon, and is a business that makes sense. Either mining, which several companies are interested in. I've heard that there's some rare earth materials that are in great quantity. They got to figure out how to get them out.
How to get them down.
And how to get them down. I think the transportation would be easier in extracting it and maybe not bringing back all the dregs. You may have to do some cleaning up there. But the first time we get a good business case, if we can find one at the Moon, building rockets, and if there's water there, that's hydrogen and oxygen, that's a fuel and an oxidizer, then we've got a different story. It's going to change the trajectory, pardon the term, of everything going on.
So I had a, without getting into my wayward history, I did actually go to a couple of community colleges in my younger days, and I had a professor who told me, and it's crazy. This is the guy who said something that's probably as profound as anything I've heard. The Earth will unite when we fire a rocket at the Moon, and it fires back. And he knew nothing about me, and I said, we tried that, it didn't work. And so, with respect to the U.S. and China, if you flash forward 20 years, I think it's entirely possible that it'll be a really different relationship with them. And you could easily see some kind of detente in space because, space for the most part, even when, I talked about competition on the Moon and things like that, and particularly when you talk about going to Mars, it's something that both countries, alliances, if you will, could gain a great deal out of, and then you can see the incentive structure working. So, all of that stuff can happen. ULA and SpaceX, no, I'm just kidding. You'll see obviously right now, we have a certain constellation of companies and things like that. But you go back 20 years to the 90s, and what did we have? We probably had 30 prime contractors, right? And now we're down to 3. And it depends on whether or not you count Raytheon in there's a prime contractor. But U.S. industry will change around lots and lots of different ways. And so we think that what we have right now is kind of stable. That's just not going to be the case.
Well, and this is a slightly tangential answer, but with the web, we're getting very close to the point at which you can start looking at exoplanets. Up till now, it's all been indirect. You're either looking at a transit and a dipping of intensity from the star, you're looking at the radial velocity method, change of spectra because of the effect on the star by a planet. It's looking at large planets. It's harder to observe terrestrial planets, rocky planets like ours. But once you can start doing that and possibly finding, a moderate shift in our approach to all this, and this doesn't necessarily apply to rocket launches, I'm talking about long-term, big picture stuff, is seeing some kind of biogenic signature in an atmosphere of an exoplanet. But if we see a technical civilization signature of some kind, like a massive release of a certain kind of radiation or certain kinds of gases that are the byproducts of a technological civilization, that really shifts the conversation a lot.
It does, but in order to make anything, we will have conversations because I think, I'm with Gerry, we'll probably find there are all kinds of signs of life, like literally thousands of planets that have some sort of biogenic signature, and that'll be great, and it'll make for great press, and the National Geographic will be like Interplanetary Geographic. But all of this stuff is so far away. So using chemical propulsion to get to Alpha Centauri takes like 40,000 years. And so if you have, even if you're going at meaningful fractions of the speed of light, you're still talking about like 10 years each way. And you kind of have to wonder that somebody goes off and they come back 20 years later and go, who are you? Some of the distances. The thing about space is it's really, really big, right? And so the distances are kind of daunting. And to make a good story out of it, you pretty much have to just take your laws of physics and torch them. And you get a ticket when you break the laws of physics. And I think it's really expensive.
Well, but in that case, I don't think it's about the going. I think it's more of a philosophical discussion about what our place in the universe is. But it could still change the way we approach things. It certainly could change the way we approach dealing with our planet if we see another civilization destroying itself.
Yeah, so we're gonna get really. We'll see something else, and we're gonna want to kill it. All right.
That's one way to go. Yeah.
That is the human condition and the human reaction to something.
Okay, one more question for the day.
We don't want to end on that one.
No, we're not going to end on that. That's depressing. So we have we're about at time, but we have one more question here from Kelvin.
Hi. So talking a little bit with you mentioned entertainment and Kim Kardashian going to space.
Yeah, I'm going to pay for that one big time.
Yeah,
it's a good thing I don't do social media because I'm just going to get torched. I don't care.
So space, kind of the justification for space has long been debated. So one justification would be maintaining public interest. So what would you see for the going forward for justification of kind of maintaining that public interest other than Kim Kardashian vomiting in space on Instagram? So what ideas would you have for kind of getting the public more involved and keeping space in the public eye?
Okay, just gave yourself a social disease.
I'm gonna I'm gonna get in even more trouble. I don't care. We have had this. I'm going to get totally flamed for this one, but I'm going to say it anyway. We have had this illusion that we need to have public support for space. But, Rod, you pointed this out earlier. If you look at the opinion polls over time, and Roger Lanius has done a great job of looking at this, it's flat. And it's flat whether we're in the heights of Apollo or the depths of post-Apollo. It's flat. There's signs that things are kind of going up now, but the truth is no matter what we do, there's a portion of the population that loves space, there's a portion of the population that thinks it's kind of cool, but will trade it off against something else that they think is cooler, and there's a portion of the population that just flat out doesn't care. And that doesn't change. And so instead of thinking about public support, think about I don't have a better word right now, but I'll call it political support. What NASA needs, what space in general needs, are solid constituencies that support it because it's in their interest. There is no more powerful constituency on the globe, maybe even on Mars, on the globe, than the global economy. And so if you can come up with things that you do in space that make money, that is the most powerful constituency you could have. Another constituency that we often, I don't think we understand just how powerful education is as a constituency, the education community. The National Education Association is the largest association and probably the most powerful in the country. And we're just starting to understand what we can do for education. And education is just starting to understand what space can do for them. So I would, instead of concentrating on broad public support, because we tried that and it hasn't really worked that well, I would concentrate on developing solid political constituencies.
So I would angle that question back to you guys. I worked in advertising for 15 years before I got involved in more space-related stuff. And we made a lot of commercials for IBM and Ford and Cartier and, all these big accounts. And the primary lesson we were given by our masters at the ad agency is you need to perfect the visual imagery that motivate fear, greed, or lust. Pick one or two of those. You're probably not going to get all three. If you do, it's a home run. And if you hit all those marks and you put it on the Super Bowl, then it's payday for everybody, and that makes a lot of people very happy. And I'm afraid that selling NASA is kind of a similar exercise. We like to think it's more noble than that, and it is regarded as one of the most recognized and noblest brands in the world by the planet. Way ahead of Coke and Nike and the other things you'd expect to beat them, depending on what metric you use. But it really does come down to, I think, basic human nature, and you have to appeal to one or more of those things. So how do we do that, Gerry?
Well, I can't answer that. But I will say this. How many of you watched William Shatner launch? I bet most of you did. I think a lot of Americans did. Michael Strahan was another that launched on Blue Origin and got a lot of coverage. Those are important pulses, but they don't come up and last. Within 2 or 3 weeks, Strahan's off doing something else, Shatner's off doing something else, and the space thing is in the past. But I think every once in a while, having that high-profile person either go into orbit or suborbital like Blue Origin does send a signal to the public that, hey, this is interesting. It's not only interesting, it's fun and can be fun. Now, as long as you don't wipe somebody out. And that worries me that the commercial side of this thing hasn't really stubbed their toe yet, and they will. They fly long enough, something's going to happen.
But one thing I have to say, I may be critical of Elon and some of the, I won't say the business practices, but their assessment of the market and projections. But what Elon has done, in particular, really, to make space exciting now is absolutely incredible. And it's a transitory phenomenon, right? Because with both Elon and Jeff Bezos, this is a little bit, I won't call it philanthropic, but it's irrational investment. It's irrational investment. They're not going to get
their money back.
Somebody who thinks in business terms is going to look at this and go, well, no, you're never going to make your money back. What it is up to us to do, I mean, this is a little bit of an artificial salient. It's up to us and the community to figure out ways of filling this in with sustainable activity. And I'll just leave it.
Well, and if we're looking for popular support, I'd argue one of the most remembered things about the entire Apollo program, which pains me deeply, is that somebody hit a golf ball on the moon. I still hear people in their 20s talk about, didn't that guy golf on the moon? It's like, yeah, but that wasn't why we went there. It was just something that somebody did, but it was a brilliant piece of public relations. And then in this century, I think the best piece of public relations I've seen with regard to space was this crazy guy that launched his car out to Martian orbit. It didn't really achieve much. It was dead mass. That was the whole point of having it there. But that image, mated to music, perfectly synced of David Bowie, when that fairing opened up, I started crying like a baby because I said, this is brilliant. And it transfixed people around the world. Now, what the long-term play out of that is, I don't know. But over the last few years, I think that's really stood out as one of the most remarkable moments. And whether or not we like it, if you're going to market the stuff, I think you have to think of those terms to some degree.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. I have an idea, Gerry. How about we do a calendar, the Modern Men of Mission Control, and you could be January.
Okay.
Thank you much. Thank you for taking your time tonight. Appreciate it very much.